evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 22nd of December 2021. And this is a home edition because unfortunately I have tested positive for COVID. So I have 10 days of isolation, but thanks to the wonderful technology of Zoom, we are still bringing you a fresh edition of Behind Headlines. So in today's program, I'll be joined by my co-host, Regan King, and together with Major Rhett Parkinson, the director of the Armed Forces Christian Union, for this Christmas edition of Behind the Headline. I'll start off with you, Rhett. So thankful that you could join us at such short notice, and I do like the Christmas jumper, and you've got a polar bear on it. So for our viewers, there we go. We're trying to get in the Christmas atmosphere, in the Christmas mood, despite me having COVID. But let's see how we get on. Rhett, you've served with distinction in the British Army, reaching to the rank of Major. Can you describe what it's like to be a Christian in the armed services, particularly at Christmas time, whether it's times of peace or whether it's time of war?
Oh, thank you, Simon, and good to join you again. It really is mixed emotions. I mean, Christmas for us is so important. And for me growing up, it was always about family and being together for family. And clearly that is an issue at Christmas time when you are deployed overseas. And certainly 2008 was my last Christmas where I was separated from my family and serving in Basra in Iraq. Thankfully in 2011, December 2011, I managed to get back just for Christmas for a couple of weeks with the family, which was very special. I think as a Christian, it's one of the highlights of the year. Christmas is all about family for me, but I think as Christians, we celebrate Christmas along with Easter as part of two of the key dates in our faith. And so Christmas particularly is really about peace, and there's a tension and as a Christian being on an operational footing, normally carrying weapons, even in church on Christmas Day, and yet celebrating the Prince of Peace. So yeah, very mixed emotions around Christmas time when you're serving in the armed forces.
And Regan, not to my knowledge, have you served in the British or American armed forces? You might surprise me right now, but share with us how different Christmas is between celebrating in the United States and celebrating it in England.
Well, in many ways, I find the British Christian experience is more church-centered. It's more based around your church family. That's been my experience here. Might not be everyone's. In the United States, I think it's actually quite uncommon to have Christmas Day services, even Christmas Eve services. Christmas Eve services may be increasing a little bit, but it's not uncommon, I think, unfortunately, for churches to even withhold a service the next Sunday after Christmas. It's very much considered a family holiday, which of course it is a family holiday, but ultimately what are we spending this time with family focused on? It's all about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so that's one difference. There are some things that we have that are very cultural. We'll have parades, Christmas parades, which occur. Some areas of the United Kingdom, I think, have a sort of parade or another, but it's not something that is done that much, unfortunately. In London, we do have a New Year's Day parade, but nothing specifically Christmas themed. One thing that we did as a family that was very big was going out viewing lights. Everyone decorates outside their houses, and you look at all of these houses. But I suppose in one way in London, where I am now, every year my wife and I will go out and we'll look at the lights on Oxford Street, Regent Street, and the surrounding areas. So, yeah, it's different. It's different.
Cool. And if we, in this program, we'll be looking back at Christmases, how they were celebrated in the past, and particularly their significance during times of war and conflict. Regan, it's quite surprising to think that Christmas has played a kind of major role in kind of British history. And we saw with the English Civil War and with Oliver Cromwell defending Parliament and overthrowing King James I, we saw at that time the rise of the Puritan movement. This movement to get back to the biblical foundation of our faith led to political ideas, and one of those big ideas was during the time of Oliver Cromwell to actually ban Christmas. We saw this also with the Puritans in the United States in the 1600s, that they banned Christmas for 2 decades in America. But we also saw that the British people were getting so fed up of not having a Christmas when it's dark and it's dreary, like it is this time of year, that they wanted Christmas back. And this was the driving force to bringing back the British monarchy with King Charles II. If he hadn't done that, we could still be a republic today. What are your thoughts on that, reasons why the Puritans wanted to get rid of Christmas?
Okay, it's interesting. There are a lot of misnomers about the Puritans. Sometimes you hear this idea that they were a rather joyless lot. Nothing could be further from the truth. They did have a great theology of joy. They believed that it was good to enjoy various things in life. There was nothing wrong with festivals and celebrations, but unfortunately, when it came to things like Christmas, which we're talking about now, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater in many ways. So you have a lot of concerns with gluttony. Okay, gluttony is not a good thing. We recognize that, but it was the idea that the people were too gluttonous around Christmas time that caused Cromwell to actually impose a ban on mince pies in the 1650s. Now, forgive me, anyone who really loves mince pies, but I cannot really imagine gorging myself on mince pies. I've had a couple of nice ones, but I just don't see how one can overeat on mince pies. They're not that nice. But Cromwell.
Careful! We might offend some of our English viewers or British viewers on this program.
I know. So Cromwell enforced this ban. There's an interesting story in 1657. Particularly, the Christmas ban didn't go down well. It caused such outrage that people began to riot, and you can read about these riots. They're called the Plum Pudding Riots. They occurred in Canterbury in 1658. In the end, Cromwell sent 3,000 soldiers from Westgate Towers to break down the city gates and enforce the Christmas ban, which is a rather incredible story, certainly. But if you look at the Puritans' idea behind it, they believed that the main focus had been missed. They believed that everything was more about gluttony, and it was very much inundated with Roman Catholic ideology and belief, and that this was a massive concern to them. So rather than saying, okay, how can we redeem Christmas? How can we take this festival, which has been celebrated since the 2nd century, it may have even been before that, but we know it was celebrated from the 2nd century. How can we redeem that and make it right? How can we celebrate this in a joyful way while keeping it? No, they were just like away with it.
So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report, and this is entitled "Why the Pilgrims Declared War on Christmas."
This time of year, it seems some Christians are on the lookout for anyone dissing Christmas.
Who's happy holidaying instead of Merry Christmasing? Who's disrespecting the Christian special day? Well, some of the very first Americans to diss Christmas were also some of its most pious Christians, the Pilgrims. And they did it right here in Plymouth.
At nearby Plymouth Plantation, Richard Pickering portrayed Pilgrim leader Edward Winslow to tell CBN News why his people disdained the holiday.
Christmas is not in the Word of God, for it is not revealed unto us when our Lord didst come or when our Lord didst go.
The Pilgrims also thought it sacrilegious the early Catholic Church had decided to place Christmas and Easter on the very same dates as already popular Roman pagan holidays.
Are they not tied to pagan rituals?
Now, you have to put this in the context of history. The Pilgrims came to America on the Mayflower not all that long after the Protestant Reformation began. The all-powerful Catholic Church looked on these Protestants as rebels and heretics, and there'd been plenty of persecution, plenty of bloodletting. So the Pilgrims wanted little to do with almost anything that had even a whiff of Catholicism about it, including these holidays like Christmas and Easter the Catholics so enthusiastically embraced.
We doth not follow the corrupt traditional calendar that doth have Christmas and Easter and all those things that are not determined in the Word of God.
By the way, the Pilgrims weren't just anti-Catholic. In those days, they were mostly known as the Separatists. And what they were trying to separate themselves from was the Church of England, which also loved itself a Christmas or Easter holiday.
Pilgrim reenactor Leo Martin runs the faith-based Jenny Museum with wife Nancy and wrote Pilgrim Pursuit of Happiness. He explained why the Pilgrims wanted to separate from the Anglican Church of England.
That was a very external church, robes, pomp, and circumstance.
The Pilgrims thought such ceremony distanced man from God and considered it fleshly.
So this was offensive to them. And one of the reasons they left the Anglican Church was that.
By the way, I received quite a tongue lashing from Winslow for calling the Pilgrims separatists.
Paul, you seem such a nice man. I don't think you meant to insult me by calling me a separatist, huh? For that is a term that is used by our enemies.
They called themselves reformers, like when it came to scrubbing out blasphemous holidays.
We have reformed the Christian calendar.
Massachusetts ruling Puritans actually banned Christmas in 1659, and it stayed illegal for more than 2 decades. Martin says the Puritans and Pilgrims would find modern Christmas events like Reno's Santa pub crawl or Philadelphia's Racing of the Santas outrageous.
And they would say to you, see what happened? You can't celebrate these pagan holidays without this kind of a result.
And in the Pilgrims' day, Christmas season might have been even rowdier.
Christmas is also a time of great debauchery in England, wherein there is much use of spirits and much making of parties.
Sort of a Mardi Gras on steroids.
And 'tis not as a Christian that I am against joy, but I am for a sober Christian cheerfulness.
How passionate were the Puritans about this? Well, when Sir Edmund Andrews took over the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the British Crown in 1686, he put on Christmas services for his fellow Church of England members here in Boston. And they were so in fear of the Puritans reacting violently, they felt they had to surround themselves with British soldiers as they met.
My, how the times have changed. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Plymouth.
Retta, just if we move forward as well to the Napoleonic Wars. Now, if we were a soldier fighting against Napoleon in France with the wars in Flanders and the war in Spain, even in Egypt as well, many of those Christmases would have been spent fighting Napoleon's forces. How important do you think Christmas was important to those soldiers to keep the morale up as they fought against Napoleon's idea to conquer the whole of Europe and establish a United States of Europe under his leadership?
Well, I think it's interesting that obviously it falls near the winter solstice, as Regan said. It's a dark time of year, and so actually your nights are long and your days are short. And my brother, who's just arrived a couple of days ago from Uganda, has reflected that he hasn't seen the sun for about 3 days, which is highly unusual for him. Whereas for us, actually, we can go, a couple of weeks without seeing the sun here. And I think as soldiers trying to survive, bearing in mind, 98, 99% of the time is waiting and in training and maneuvers and so on. It's just 1 or 2% that's in sheer terror when you're actually in conflict as well. And that doesn't happen very often. I know we'll come on to it in another conflict in a moment. That doesn't tend to happen around about the 25th of December in the Northern Hemisphere, in largely the Christian sort of countries. I think life was fairly brutal back in the early 1800s, and so I imagine that anything that they could they could buy. Of course, Wellington was famous that, unlike the French, who just ravaged and pillaged whatever they could get from the local areas, Wellington had a much more organized logistics system where he insisted that they paid for and bought all their food and wine and so on. So I think the opportunities to pause, to maybe save some of the additional rations, or to have an opportunity to have a bit of a party. Certainly in Iraq, there's a tradition where on Christmas Day in the British Army, we, the officers, serve the soldiers an awful concoction called gunfire, which is tea with rum in it. And we'll go around, give the guys a day off between the officers and the seniors. We'll take their duties on sentry and around the bases and so on. And obviously, the environment, tactical situation allowing, we then serve them gunfire, and we'll serve them Christmas dinner as well. How far that goes back, and whether that goes back to the Napoleonic Wars, I'm not too certain. I guess fighting for the British Army was predominantly in the 10 years up to the Battle of Waterloo, which kind of finished that era and finished off Napoleon Bonaparte. Fighting was predominantly in the Iberian Peninsula, so maybe slightly warmer than in the United Kingdom, but still pretty tough at the same time.
No, absolutely. And it's also interesting to note that the Battle of Waterloo occurred on June the 17th, 1815, and had Wellington's forces not won that battle, the Western world could have been speaking French rather than English, and this would have prohibited the gospel going forth to the four corners of the world. And this is why it was such a battle. It was a battle between God's laws and God's statutes, together with this, what we see today in Europe, and this militant secular humanism that Napoleon supported. Regan, if we also then come back also to the First World War now, I'm just checking my notes here, we got this right. So yeah, so if we come back to the kind of First World War, I mean, this is one of the most extraordinary stories in warfare when it comes to Christmas. The Christmas Day truce of the 25th of December 1914, when British and German generals were warning no fraternization with the enemy, and yet it was the Germans who started to sing Silent Night over the other side of the trenches that would actually bring these two enemies together for a day of peace, even a football match, sharing a presence that marked the hostility during the only time during that horrific conflict.
It's an incredible story, Simon. It's helpful to remember that this came very early on in the war. This was only 5 months into the hostilities. And so, I mean, honestly, I'm not certain that we would have seen the same sort of truce at any other point in time. Both sides had this slogan, among the soldiers, they would be home in time for Christmas. This was a common idea. The war would be over by Christmas. In many ways, a lot of the armies involved initially were involved, quite reluctantly. It was due to a lot of treaties and alliances being made going back to the 19th century, and really as a consequence of the Napoleonic Wars, that there were boundaries that were set. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo, this sparks a massive diplomatic crisis where you have nation that is allied with nation that's allied with another nation in all of these complex agreements that entail and necessitate essentially this global war. But 5 months in, on Christmas Day, we see hostilities cease. It was unofficial. It was not planned, but it, I think, does show, Simon, the power of the good news of Jesus Christ. It shows the power of the message behind Christmas, as the German soldiers sing "Still Not," and others, doubtless, I'm sure, across the trenches would have joined in. And then you can just picture individuals maybe checking out, okay, is this okay? Is it possible to go over the trench without being shot? And just testing it out. But there were over 100,000 British and German troops involved in the cessation of hostility on that day, and they placed candles on trenches and on makeshift Christmas trees even. They continued to celebrate with each other with Christmas carols. Both sides exchanged Christmas carols. There would have been people exchanging small gifts as well across no man's lands.
Rhett, what are your thoughts on that famous Christmas Day truce between the British, French, and German forces that really did change history?
Well, I think we hadn't, as Regan was saying, I think that we hadn't seen the sort of full scale and horror rising. It was only a few months later, in April 1915, that the Germans used 150 tons of chlorine gas for the first time, and that was probably one of the turning points. It was their only offensive in 1915, in the Battle of Ypres. I think it's the sort of thing that happens. Interestingly, the war had only really settled into sort of stalemate in the previous few weeks. So the extensive trench systems that we associated with the First World War hadn't really been completed or really developed. They were still fairly rudimentary, pretty grim conditions, to be honest. I think the Germans were better at making more permanent and defensive positions and trenches than the Allies were. But I think as they, just reading around it a little bit, the Christmas Eve, the firing died down. And it was very different on different sectors. So there was a lot more sort of mission command, a lot more autonomy for the individual divisional commanders and so on, rather than later in the war, where everything was very much done on a centralized basis, and the commands very much were directed from the very top. And I think reading around it kind of happened in a whole series of different locations. We think of, one football match. Actually, again, reading around it, was a couple of hundred people kicking a ball around it. It wasn't a sort of formalized Germany, England 11-a-side football match.
That's where we get the rivalry from today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we must have beaten the Germans in that game, because this would explain the incredible tense rivalry between England and Germany whenever we play each other. But thankfully, we beat them in the Euros 2-0.
So yeah, and I think it would have been very cautious. A lot of people would have been very cautious. But with the singing of the carols, they were close enough that they could shout out. I think there was a sort of bonhomie, a camaraderie between what was largely two professional armies at that stage. All the soldiers had been mostly serving before war was declared, as opposed to a couple of years later, where you very much got very large conscript armies, people being shoved into the front line largely against their will. So I think it was something that reflected a wish for peace. I think the command came down on it like a ton of bricks afterwards, and there was that order of no fraternization on both sides, sadly, and we never saw that again, either in the First World War or to my knowledge in the Second World War either. So it was quite unique in December 14.
So let's go to this excellent CBN news report. It's entitled First War Christmas Truce, which is an incredible story.
To the glory of God.
Each year, Andrew Hamilton lays a wreath at the World War I monument in his small English village, a tribute to the grandfather he barely knew.
What do you remember of him?
I just remember an old man who shouted a lot because he was deaf, and he lost his hearing really during the First World War. So he was really quite frightening. And then when I read his diaries, I was amazed, I suppose, at the life that he'd been involved in. This one is the original one, which he would have kept in his top pocket.
As Hamilton writes in his book, Meet at Dawn Unarmed, his grandfather, Captain Robert Hamilton, kept diaries from 1913 to 1950. Most years were fairly mundane, with one remarkable exception, 1914.
Wednesday the 5th of August, wire to mobilise at 5:30 a.m.
Hamilton was part of the initial wave of British troops in what came to be known as the First World War. The general consensus at the time was the fighting would be over by Christmas. Just one day earlier, German troops had invaded Belgium, and then England joined the fight. Ironically, the leaders of the opposing sides were first cousins, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II and King George V of England. Caught in the middle, the tiny country of Belgium.
This very provincial, rural area of Belgium was almost at the center of the world attention. I grew up listening to stories of elderly people in my village that had to do with the war.
German troops cut a path of destruction through Belgium into France. Allied forces stopped them outside of Paris, pushing them back, but only so far. A stalemate ensued, with both sides digging in, literally. Trench warfare on the Western Front had begun.
September the 18th, several men killed and wounded in the trenches by shell fire. This was, without exception, the most miserable night ever spent. I stood all night in water up to my ankles and the rain pouring down.
This is one of the original trenches from more than 100 years ago. Two parallel zigzagging lines built by the German and Allied forces stretching more than 450 miles. In some places, the opposing armies were only 50 yards apart.
Both parties have dug in, and the cold is coming in. And so all of a sudden, the first enemy is not your opponent to the other side of the no man's land, but it's the cold.
By the end of November, there were over 1.5 million casualties on the Western Front. As the stalemate continued, it became clear the war would not be over by Christmas. The outside world pushed for an official Christmas truce, including Pope Benedict IV, who asked that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien, however, issued a directive forbidding fraternization, saying it destroys the offensive spirit in all ranks.
December the 24th, we marched up to our trenches, a little downhearted to spend Christmas Day in them.
Artist Bruce Bairnsfather was machine gun officer in Captain Hamilton's Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He recounted his war experiences in the book Bullets and Billets.
I remember at the time being very down on my luck about this, as everything in the nature of Christmas Day festivities was obviously knocked on the head.
But the Germans didn't let war stop their celebration. They displayed Christmas trees in their trenches, and on December 23rd, held a church service in a bombed-out sugar refinery. Schoolteacher Kurt Zemisch served in the 134th Saxon Regiment. Like Hamilton, he kept a diary during the war.
We sang the song, "This is the day that the Lord has made." The celebration moved many to tears.
I think Christmas in those days was much more an important festival in the German culture than it was in French or Belgian or Anglo-Saxon countries.
I ordered my men that on Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day, no shots were to be fired from our side if it could be avoided.
Then something extraordinary happened.
No sooner had we settled into the trenches, we and the Brits tried to draw attention to each other.
Silent night, oh
the spirit of Christmas began to permeate us all, and we tried to plot ways and means of making the next day, Christmas, different in some way to others.
An Englishman called over to our trenches. "I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year." To which I replied to him and his comrades, "Thank you very much. I wish the same to you."
After months of vindictive sniping and shelling, this little episode came as an invigorating tonic and a welcome relief to the daily monotony of antagonism.
Regan, do you think when we look back over 100 years ago and remember marking this nation marked the start of the First World War 100 years ago, back in 2014, and yet we even see Christmas adverts like Sainsbury's use the Christmas Day truce to kind of market their products. There's something about that event that captures the kind of public imagination, and particularly a time of Christmas and time of conflict, that think that the gospel and the power of Christmas carols and this desire to bring peace can actually bring a cessation of hostility and violence, even if it was just for 24 hours. Only the gospel could do that, couldn't it? And the power of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one carol that stands out in the bleak midwinter, and it encapsulates this idea of, in some way, unpleasantness, chaos, some disturbance, darkness, but light coming into the world. Indeed, Isaiah chapter 9 points in a prophetic way 700 years into the future to the birth of the Messiah, and it's highlighted that the Messiah will come upon a land where there is deep darkness. Light will break into a place that is only known darkness, and there's going to be it promises every battle garment will be burned as fuel for fire. There's going to be peace and joy as a really excellent harvest time, because to us a child is born, to us a son is given, who will take the government, God's government, and will reign forever. And so there's that fulfillment that's initial in Jesus Christ in his first coming, but then there's still that extra forever eternal element of that prophecy for which we wait. And in a world filled with much darkness, where things can be quite bleak, even right now, we can look and hope to the coming again of Jesus.
Absolutely. And Rhett, if we go on to the Second World War, all I can think of is the contrasting Christmases between Christmas 1939 and Christmas 1940, and how these would have been two very, very different Christmases in Great Britain. Describe for us how different these Christmases would have been, considering that, yes, the Britain declared war against Germany after they invaded Poland on the 2nd of September 1939, but effectively we're in a phony war against the Germans. And then if we look forward to December 1940, I mean, we had during that year the miraculous deliverance of Dunkirk. We had the Battle of Britain. We had the Nazis completely overrun through blitzkrieg the whole of Europe. And then, of course, particularly Londoners, more than anywhere else, would have faced the Blitz as well. So describe how these two different Christmases would have been, both in 1939 and 1940.
Well, I think 1939 must have been pretty much a normal Christmas with wartime constraints. I don't have to my fingertips exactly when rationing came in. That would have played a factor. So perhaps some of the things they might have enjoyed on the Christmas table in 1938 weren't available in 1939. But except for some skirmishes and some significant battles at sea as well, I think those first 3-4 months of the Second World War were relatively quiet. We had troops deployed in France. tens of thousands of troops. So a lot of people would have been anxious about what the future holds, the uncertainty. I mean, to some extent, we can have a tiny taste of what uncertainty around the COVID pandemic currently, with Omicron running rampant across the United Kingdom and around the world. You exaggerate that where actually it's human against human in battle. So there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about the future. And in some ways, those fears perhaps were realized in 1940, so that by December 1940, rather than a battle over there, we'd recovered, the bulk of the British Expeditionary Forces, but lost and seen, the whole of Europe sort of fall under Hitler's armies. And I think the fear of the future, the sense of having our backs against the wall, would have been very tangible. The loss of perhaps hope. How on earth was, what would December 41 bring? And of course, Pearl Harbor came in on the 6th of December 1941, and the Americans were in the war, albeit totally shocked initially by the Japanese attacks a year after that. But yeah, pretty grim, I think, in all honesty, by December 40, and I think a lot of people struggling to make the most of it in a pretty dark time in history.
And if you look at the Blitz in 1940, particularly, the Blitz actually occurred at Christmas time of 1940, and so many would have been spending their Christmas in bomb shelters, in underground as well. There's a particularly harrowing artist's impression of a shelter in Camden Town under a brewery on Christmas Eve, and this you can see at the War Museum in London. But it's important to realize that it's even in those dark moments, it's even, and perhaps especially through those dark moments, that we perhaps can most appreciate the real meaning behind Christmas. We're talking about God becoming man, not being born into a palace, but being born laid in a manger surrounded by barn animals. It's quite a harrowing story in and of itself.
Like those behind you.
Yes, exactly.
And Rhett, I mean, it would have been very, very tough, wouldn't it, for the British Isles during Christmas of 1940, as Regan mentioned, pretty much when the Blitz started, particularly for the Londoners, those in the big cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool being hit, maybe Coventry as well, being hit by German bombers during that time, knowing that a number of British troops are out fighting the Germans. Many of the British troops that thought that they were going to die on the beaches of Dunkirk came back. So kind of a mixed Christmas, but I'm sure that through the power of prayer and through a godly and righteous king calling for national days of prayer and repentance, this must have given the British people a lot of hope, because back then we did have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. We did have faith in God, and we believed in miracles.
And I think that was much more ingrained in our culture. And it's interesting, isn't it, that when times are tough, people look for something more to life. And in the 21st century, we live very comfortable lives in the West. There is real apathy because, largely speaking, we want for nothing. We can go onto Amazon and order whatever we want, and it will turn up the next day. Whereas I think back then, I think particularly of the soldiers who, particularly maybe from the London Regiment, for example, who would have been deployed elsewhere. We were fighting in North Africa. We had troops deployed all around the world, India and elsewhere. And they were worried about their families back home, because home, is normally a safe area. And I know, for example, at the moment, there are sailors deployed on submarines at the moment, and on ships and soldiers and airmen deployed overseas as well. And they're worried now about families back home with Omicron, with COVID, like yourself and others. And, you know, home is traditionally a safe place. And we in the armed forces go out to face the danger wherever that is. But suddenly, back in December 40 and to some extent now with COVID, home is not that safe place. And therefore, you're worried for those back home, just as they're worried for you out on deployment, out on the front line, out in North Africa, fighting the Italians, the Germans, whoever.
Absolutely. And one of the best books I've ever read on the Second World War is this book called A Higher Call. And I'll just read you a little bit of the back page. It says, 5 days before Christmas in 1943, a badly damaged Allied bomber, which was an American bomber plane, struggled to fly over wartime Germany. At its controls was a 21-year-old American pilot. Half his crew lay wounded or dead. Suddenly, a Messerschmitt fighter pulls up on the bomber's tail. The German pilot was an ace, who, with a squeeze of the trigger, could bring down the struggling bomber. This is the incredible story of the Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown and Second Lieutenant Franz Stinger. The two pilots' lives collided that day. It was an encounter that would haunt both pilots for 40 years, until, as old men, they would seek out one another and reunite. This is one of the most incredible stories during the Second World War that I've ever read, and particularly knowing that here we have a German Messerschmitt fighter pilot escorting an American bomber out of Germany, so that the anti-artillery guns that were stationed on the ground wouldn't actually fire at this bomber, despite the fact they only had 1 or 2 engines left, and was able to make it back to England, back to base, so those crew members could celebrate Christmas. Rhett, just describe for us what it would have been like probably for that American air crew, knowing that they were seeing this German Messerschmitt fighter. The plane is completely broken up. It doesn't look like it's going to be able to make it back to England. They thought, this is all over. Then suddenly he escorts them out of Germany, tries to take them to Sweden, but they were too scared, and they then flew all the way over to Lincoln and miraculously were able to land.
Yeah, I think there was clearly a standoff. I read the story briefly earlier, and I'd love to read the book. Actually, it's very intriguing. Miraculously, only the tail gunner was killed. He was decapitated when a cannon hit his head. But they only had 3 out of 11 of their 50 caliber machine guns that were able to fire. So I think the pilot instructed Second Lieutenant Brown, said, well, train your gun on the Messerschmitt, but only open fire if he opens fire on us. Interesting. I read the German fighter pilot had been hugely impacted. He'd fought in North Africa, and his squadron commander had said, if I ever hear you shooting down someone under a parachute, I will personally shoot you. And I think that idea of having mercy on your enemy when they're clearly, the chips are down, it's a bit like not shooting, injured enemy. And we've seen trials about that to do with Afghanistan and so on. That is part of the Geneva Convention, but that concept of not shooting people who are effectively vulnerable, and amazingly, that whole crew did a full did their 25 missions, and they all, less the tail gunner, they all survived the war, and I think one died in the 90s, and all the rest after the turn of the millennium, which is remarkable, really, and as well that the German fighter pilot, he ended up flying Me-262s, the jet engine fighter engine that Hitler was so keen on, but they all survived the war. And I think the lovely part of the story is that the two veterans, the German and the pilot of the bomber, were reconciled 40 or 50 years later, and were able to talk to, became good friends until they died within a few months of each other.
Amazing. And Franz found himself living in in Canada, in Vancouver, so they weren't very far apart, which was an incredible story during the Second World War. We've also got this video to show you now about a US Second World War tank division.
We're speaking with Adam Makos, author of the book Spearhead. It's an exciting story about tank warfare in World War II. Adam, why should people care about wanting to read about some tank guys in World War II?
They led the way to victory. And a lot of times I always thought the paratroopers or the infantry guys were the first in front. But really, these men in the Spearhead division, that was their specialty, piercing through the enemy lines and driving behind the enemy lines and winning these big battles. But with it, there was a big downside. They lost a lot of men, a lot of tanks. They paid a lot of sacrifices.
You concentrate on this one crew that has this guy Clarence as the guy who shoots off the guns all the time. And they were special in the fact that they got a tank that was better than all the others right towards the end of the war, right? That was an important part of how they managed to survive their battles.
We had the Sherman tank, and we thought it was the best tank ever. And then the Germans just kept getting bigger and better, and they were beating ours around. So as an emergency measure, we had to rush these 20 Pershing tanks to the European theater, and our hero Clarence got one of them. He was just a 21-year-old corporal from Coal Country, Pennsylvania, and now he's given the most advanced tank in the American arsenal, the only tank that can go toe-to-toe with the Germans. And with that comes a new responsibility. He has to lead the way in every attack since then.
Since one of his biggest motivations was surviving the war, that was always on his mind. So they got to Cologne, and it was important that they take the city of Cologne in Germany, and there was a tank, a Panzer tank, that was sort of waiting for them there, right? And they got into a one-on-one duel. And what was it about the American tank that ended up allowing them to survive the fact that the Germans could have shot the first shot?
The difference really was that man, Clarence Schmoyer, the gunner of the American tank. You see, he knew that he had to shoot first and shoot straight and not miss, because if he missed, somebody in his crew was going to die, and his crew was his family. He used to say, we're a family locked in a sardine can.
And wasn't it also a fact that the German guy in the tank, he thought because this was a new American tank, he thought it was maybe one of theirs. He wasn't sure that he was about to kill a German tank.
Clarence had an advantage that day. The German hesitated. A millisecond could be the difference in a battle like that. They say it was like a Western gunfight in the streets of Cologne.
And one of the saddest things is just before this one-on-one battle, a civilian car drove through, and both sides started to shoot at it, right? And what happened with that car?
They shot and they wounded, and then later she died. A civilian woman. Her name was Katharina Esser. She was just a grocery store clerk, but she was driving through the city, trying to flee the city of Cologne.
And then that was on Clarence's mind for decades. And tell me how it finally ended, that with him and one of the Germans from that tank meeting in Cologne, and what did the Germans say to Clarence to give him peace finally about the way that woman died?
It stayed with Clarence for decades, and eventually he had to talk to somebody. Now his whole crew had all died by then. Who was left? Just the man he fought against. And so he traveled to Germany, and in front of the cathedral, he and Gustav Schaefer, the young German tank gunner who was back then was 18, who was battling him, they put their arms around each other, and Clarence said, the war is over, we can be friends now. Gustav said, here's where my tank was, here's where Clarence's tank was. And these men said, this is where the mistake happened. And Gustav said those beautiful words that would later give Clarence peace. He said, Clarence, it's war. It's in the nature of it. It can't be undone. War was what was responsible. War was what took her life.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for telling us about it. This has been Adam Makos we've been speaking to, author of the book Spearhead, a New York Times bestseller. Thank you very much, Adam.
Rhett, what would it have been like if you were actually a tank commander in one of those tanks during the Second World War? Because I suppose the hardest period of the fighting really came in December of 1944 with the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, in which we saw a huge resistance against by the Nazis against the Allied forces, together with the incredible cold conditions. And we've seen some incredible films that portrayed the Battle of the Bulge. And what stands out in my memory is the Band of Brothers. So what would it have been like for those tank commanders at Christmas fighting in Europe in 1944 to liberate Europe from the Nazis?
Well, I'm incredibly desperate. I mean, clearly the tide had turned. The second front had opened with the landings of D-Day on the 6th of June, 1944. But that winter was a particularly cold one, probably one of the coldest that decade, if not within a few decades. And a lot of people suffered. A lot of I know that a lot of Dutch people died of starvation because the food was just not getting through. I had the privilege about 20 years ago of leading a battlefield tour to Normandy, and in fact I've done the Battle of the Bulge a couple of times as well. And we had a veteran in Normandy, and he was a tank commander. He started as a sergeant, finished as a major in the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, and 3 RTR actually fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was knocked out of tanks 13 times and lived to tell the tale. He survived the whole war. Makes an interesting comment halfway through the war of, at this point I decided not to make any more friends because I'd lost so many in the war. I think it was brutal. I think particularly since the British were using petrol engines, if you did get hit, the tank went up in flames very, very quickly. I think that was the greatest fear, was getting stuck in the tank, in a fire, trapped in the tank when it was on fire, and trying to get out of that. I think it was quite rough. I mean, you at times, if the mortar fire or the artillery or just the threat of small arms fire, they'd actually live inside the tank for extended periods of time. If you could, you would have bedrolls and you would roll out. And so more at night, they didn't have the night fighting capability to fight at night. But people would have been aware that the end of the war was coming, and therefore not wanting to take the extra risks. They'd already faced, like this guy, they'd faced a lot of risks. So just surviving the war was probably uppermost in their minds.
Regan, what are your thoughts, particularly on the way that Christmas has played a role in keeping the morale of our armed forces, whether it's in the United States or whether this is in Britain, to keep their faith alive, to encourage them, but also to give much needed support and comfort to those back home who are missing their loved ones, who are fighting, defending the country in various wars that we discussed, whether it's the Napoleonic War, whether this was the First World War or the Second World War, or also modern wars such as Iraq or Afghanistan.
Christmas serves as a marker every year in which people center essentially the whole of winter around. It's, I think it's sung in the Muppets Christmas Carol, the Summer of the Soul in December. So I think that we can look at Christmas as, regardless of common grace, whether someone is a Christian or not, it's a common grace that the celebration element of it lifts the spirit, but particularly when an individual knows the real meaning of Christmas, when they know Jesus Christ, God becoming man to eventually end all wars, end it all and to bring peace on earth, that makes the story so much more impactful and meaningful, and enables us to see that light in the darkness.
And Rhett, also, can you describe, summing up, how important it is that we not only pray but support the Christians in the serving in armed forces, and you do an incredible work, you and your team, through the Armed Forces Christian Union, how much they need our prayers, how much they need our support, because many of them will find themselves away from their families, particularly at Christmas, and they could be involved in conflict zones as well. So how important is it that we really do pray and support Christians serving in our armed forces today?
Thank you, Simon. Well, I would say please do bear in mind all those who are deployed on operations. Many of them, under the water in submarines or in harm's way, and their families back home, and trying to celebrate without knowing what the future holds. I think there are opportunities that Christmas brings to present the gospel. And I would therefore ask that you pray, especially not just that all Christians are faithful in their portrayal of the Lord Jesus Christ, but also particularly our chaplains who have opportunities to share that good news at Christmas.
Excellent. So Rhett and Regan, I just want to wish you all a wonderful happy Christmas and a wonderful happy new year. And you've done a great job on this program today. I think my voice has just lasted right to the end of the program, which will be good. So I also want to thank you for watching this program at home. I think it's important to remember the role that Christmas has played during major conflicts where we fought against evil, whether that's in the Napoleonic Wars, whether that was during the First World War against Imperial Germany, or whether that was in the Second World War. There can be no doubt that Christmas has played a major role in the lives of our nations as we fought against evil and tyranny. And so I want to wish you all a wonderful and happy Christmas, and particularly for those like myself having to self-isolate over Christmas. I really feel for you. I know what it's like, so just hang in there, and by the grace of God we'll get through it. So very much looking forward to joining you all in 2022 when we go back to the studios for a live edition of Behind the Headlines.